So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first FRIBIS annual conference and welcome to our panel session, The Social Contract and the New Ordoliberalism. My name is Lida and I'm now working for the FRIBIS. Today we will also have the Professor Neumärker. Now here we have the Professor Neumärker, the head of the FRIBIS, and Mr. Otto, a PhD student at King's College of London. Today, each of us will give a short speech on our topic. If you have any questions, please just leave us a comment and we will be happy to discuss it with you. So Otto, can you go first?
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen with you and we can get started. Okay, you should see my screen now, is that correct? Good. Okay, so, well, I'm very glad to be able to speak here because Freiburg is one of the foundational centers for constitutional thinking in economics. And I want to speak today about constitutional thinking and how it applies to the Ubi debate, in particular in the context of the the crisis management debate. And so I think FRIBIS is a perfect hosting place for this discussion. So what is the constitutional perspective? Well, first of all, let me give you the outline of my talk. First, I'll just explain what the constitutional perspective is, how it relates to the rule of law perspective, and what does it have to do with crisis management. And then I will explain James Buchanan's Democrat model as one possible foundation stone for moving towards a kind of constitutional perspective towards crisis management in the welfare state. I will also say a few words of how that relates to this Ordo tradition of Freiburg, and I hope to do more work on that connection later. So this is really based on two papers of mine, both of which are of open access, freely available. If you Google my name, Google the names of these papers, you will be able to access them without a paywall, which is always so important to facilitate debate. So please have a look at these papers, one on crisis management and UBI, and the other on James Buchanan's Democrat, written with John Meadowcroft. So I really want to start by explaining the institutional context. So the context is such that the need for crisis management as a foundational part of institutional thinking and policymaking is stronger now than ever, because people are recognizing that crises are a permanent feature of our world. The financial crisis, global warming, pandemics like the COVID crisis are good examples of how preparing for crises and responding to crises are very, very important parts of any institutional structure. And so in this context, and also more broadly, UBI has been debated with other welfare state schemes. And the COVID crisis alone has resulted in hundreds of countries, or practically all the countries in the world, have experimented with different crisis management responses. Their existing tools, permanent tools, have been tested against real-world experiment, how well they've been preparing for this. And also they've set up hundreds, if not thousands, of new policies and ad hoc relief programs as a response to the pandemic. So one of the paradoxes of crisis management is that you need to find the balance between rigid rule-based responses and flexible discretionary responses. Because on the one hand, rigid rule-based responses are often too inflexible and maladaptive, while discretionary responses are often too rash, ill-informed, inadequate, disproportionate, or unjust. Because you have to make big decisions very quickly without sufficient information, and sometimes with excessive powers, so people overstep their boundaries. So we need to find a new balance. We need to be able to improve our automatic crisis management capacities and combine them with supplementary discretionary crisis management strategies. So the big debate here is between rules on the one hand and discretion on the other hand. Both are clearly needed, but in what proportion and in what forms? So my argument, simplified to anticipate my conclusion, is that I believe there is room for increasing the scope of rule-based decision-making over discretionary decision-making in the crisis management context, but also in the welfare state governance context more broadly. And this, of course, to me, suggests that policies like UBI, which are more rule-based, as I shall explain, have some advantages over more targeted or discretionary cash transfer programs because they rely less on discretionary action. So overall, we want to be moving towards something like a more permanent crisis management framework, which is based on rules and pre-established social insurance programs and the like, which prepare us for crises with less need for sort of ad hoc decision making, although the latter will always be there and can never be eliminated. So UBI as a rule-bound welfare system makes sense because it is structured according to very simple rules. It is regularly given at a modest level as a cash form to all citizens or permanent residents. So it relies on rules that grant rights and duties to citizens vis-a-vis each other and the state. It embodies the norms of generality and non-discrimination, which are at the heart of the rule of law approach. Generality, because it is given at the same level under different circumstances to all citizens, and non-discrimination, because nobody can be denied it if they fulfill the few basic inclusion criteria, such as citizenship and the like. So what is crisis then? In fact, defining crisis is surprisingly hard. The world is predictable, unpredictable, and uncontrollable in many ways, and crises come in different forms. Indeed, as the economist Frank Knight has explained, the world today embodies what he called radical uncertainty. Excuse me. So crises in some forms are a persistent feature of a complex society. So the world, according to especially complexity theory, which I won't go into the details of it here, but it suggests that the world is something like this, that the world is very complex. It's full of heterogeneous, that is very different looking agents and institutions. And it is no surprising that crises are a persistent feature because of the complexity of the world. Indeed, economic life is full of crises, but many of those crises are micro crises. That is, they only occur on the level of the individual, the family, or the neighborhood. They may be very short-lived, and so many of those never become news stories. Many of those never become official political agendas. The most news stories are about macro crises, like the ones I mentioned I started with. Of course, they impact more people, so they are more important in that sense. But good governance requires understanding that the permanent crisis management framework, that is the rules of political institutions that prepare us for difficult circumstances, should account for not only the micro crises, but also micro crises, and the fact that they come in so many different shapes and sizes. So crisis management has two components, as I've explained. It has the discretionary component, which relies on ad hoc decision-making, relies on granting of emergency powers and emergency norms, and it has a rule-based component, which relies on pre-planned preparations, existing automatic institutional responses, which are activated or relied upon in times of crisis. So if I focus on the latter, because I think the rule-based side of it has been neglected or there's room for improvement, let me say this. Permanent institutions and legal rules that guide agents through crises should be strengthened, and there are ways in which we can do so. So this is really focusing on what is traditionally called the rule of law. The rule of law is precisely that part of the legal framework that relies on those permanent structures, background structures, that guide agent interactions, vis-a-vis each other and the state. It's really the capacity of the framework to provide stable expectations over long term and to embody kind of rules of generality and non-discrimination and so on. And practically speaking, it refers to things like property rights, quite obviously, courts, police, but also social insurance structures, and arguably also something like UBI. But anyway, in the discussion, Lon Fuller, for example, has listed several norms that the rule of law framework should embody, things like generality, publicity, and so on. You can look at the list yourself here. In the Anglo-liberal tradition, rule of law has been theorized for centuries, really starting with John Locke and David Hume. Dicey and Hayek have developed it further, where they emphasize the fact of the general rules and their capacity to facilitate agent interactions over long periods of time and under changing circumstances and unpredictable events, including crises, which are indeed the very definition of unpredictable. This also brings us to the constitutional perspective. The constitutional perspective is one of the key cornerstones of the rule of law perspective. And the Constitution is the place where the foundations of the rule of law are set. It refers to the basic rules that limit government power and protect citizens' rights. In the German tradition, this also has a long history of thinking of the Rechtsstaat. The Rechtsstaat is the state that guarantees the rule of law. And in particular, in the Freiburg Ordoliberal tradition, this has been developed further, and especially in Walter Eucken, in his writings on the Ordnungspolitik, the idea of politics as the setting of the abstract rules, which are fundamentally constitutional and in the basic structure of social organization. Ordnungspolitik focuses on those rules and that constitutional choice. So here's Eucken here. I won't go deep into his theories here, but here's a quote from Victor Warnberg, another Freiburg scholar, who says that for the Otto school, how markets function is to a significant extent a matter of constitutional choice, the choice of rules that define the constraints within which market participants can pursue their own purposes. So now let me go to the UBI debate and the welfare state debate. So the question is, of course, is the rule of law compatible with the welfare state? If so, what kind? So if you go to the scholars I've mentioned, Hayek, Dicey, and Fuller and others, they all have slightly different interpretations of what it means. All of them say that rule of law is compatible with some kind of what we today call welfare state, but they have different interpretations of what it means. However, today I want to focus on another scholar, James Buchanan, who comes from America. So he's not a Freiburg scholar, but his work is very much, I think, in the spirit of and connected to the Freiburg way of thinking. He represents the Virginia School of Political Economy, which is more in the tradition of Anglo-liberalism, but it's also heavily focused on the constitutional perspective. And excuse me, as scholars like Victor Warnberg have explained, there are strong links between Buchanan and Eucken in particular, the early Freiburg school, and Buchanan's thinking on constitutional matters. And why Buchanan is important is because he has developed a constitutional model of basic income, which is very much in the spirit of what I have been saying. The constitutional choice, the rule of law framework, the basic rules that set the stage for agent interactions. And I believe his model could inform future Otto thinking on this matter, and also future thinking of basic income as a constitutional matter. So here are some of his major works. The one in the center and the one in the right are the ones among the many books and writings where he actually developed his model of basic income, what he called the demogrant. So his general approach to welfare state governance, or governance more broadly, excuse me, is that his premise was that political coalitions will often rationally try to use the welfare state to advance their own interest, which is called rent seeking in the literature, as opposed to the general interest. So this is part of the public choice perspective and the constitutional political economy perspective. So the normative foundation of his thinking on this issue is that politics may be made better in the evaluation of all participants if political action can be constrained constitutionally. So we need to come up with rules that constrain political action, in particular in the context of the welfare state, in setting the basic rules under which the tax system works and the transfer system works. So his UBI model, what he called the Democrat, has two important characteristics. On the one hand, he wished to use the model to embody the rule of law principles of generality and non-discrimination, as I have explained earlier, and apply them to the welfare state. So basic income is supposed to make it more so that the welfare state is in fact maximally general and maximally non-discriminatory in its basic functions. Everybody gets it, nobody is denied access to basic rules, and there's less room for rent seeking as well. The second foundational principle is that it is implemented outside of realm of day-to-day politics as a constitutional rule. So again, the principles of generality and non-discrimination implemented as constitutional rule. So this is the final thing I want to quote from him. Once chosen and in place, the UBI system will remain quasi-permanent, focus on quasi-permanent, and hence immune from period-to-period manipulation due to shifting majority coalitions. In this sense, constitutionalization implies that the transfer system, once chosen, is appropriately treated as off the table for the interplay of ordinary majoritarian politics. So quasi-permanence, constitutionalization. Hence, I believe it is important for constitutional approach to permanent crisis management as well. So the lessons we should draw from him as the UBI can potentially be seen as a tool of constitutional decision-making and therefore also of permanent crisis management. UBI can be seen as a tool, potentially, at least under some models, of constraining excessive government power and welfare state rent seeking, in addition to the many other pros and cons that it may have. So what conclusions should we draw from this? Well, I've only very briefly gone through some ways of thinking about this issue, but I think the key insights are as follows. So first, I think we should be moving more towards kind of a strengthening the permanent crisis management framework. So we should start from the premise that the world is complex and full of emergent crises, both micro and macro. And they are indeed a permanent feature of the social world, of the social order, especially in a complex, interconnected and evolving economy. And therefore, crises may even be becoming more common and more serious as time goes on, as the system gets more complex and hard to control. So institutional risk assessment and institutional design should be more concerned with developing and strengthening the framework of permanent crisis management. So the general balance that we need to find, the general tension that we need to resolve is between, on the one hand, the inflexibility of the rule of law framework and the flexibility of discretionary actions. So currently, I think there's an over-reliance on ad hoc legislation, which is the result of the fact that we do not have sufficient automatic and permanent rule-based responses available from which to draw on. If we did have those, there would be less need for ad hoc legislation. For example, special benefits to special businesses or special individuals. We could have more reliance on something like basic income, which would reduce the need, if not eliminate the need for special benefits on top. Excessive reliance on discretionary decision-making, especially in times of crisis, tends to erode on multiple levels the rule of law framework, because it grants more special and emergency powers, which lack the principles of generality and non-discrimination, and they are very hard to predict and they are very liable to abuse and rent-seeking. And it also leads to political uncertainty. So all of this goes to goes to sort of mean that crises, unless there exists sufficient permanent rule-based responses, can be used as ways to erode the constitutional structures under which we live and the rule of law framework under which we live. So if this is so, could UBI then be part of this kind of a rule-based permanent crisis management framework? I believe perhaps so. I mean, Buchanan has developed one concrete model of how to do this. Other models have been proposed from different perspectives. I think there's room for thinking of UBI as a potentially implemented constitutional rule. If this is achieved, UBI could provide rapid help in times of crisis. So at least theoretically, UBI is compatible with the rule of law principles of simplicity, transparency, permanence, publicity, and especially generality and non-discrimination. Because it relies on simple rules, it grants certain rights and duties that are easy to understand and very predictable, and that leave no people outside of its scope. So theoretically, it could be used to limit government discretionary power, provide automatic support for people in times of crisis, both micro and macro, and to strengthen the rule of law framework in the welfare state, and perhaps move towards a new kind of Ordnungspolitik in the Ordo sense of the Freiburg school. So I think Freiburg scholars should study Buchanan's UBI model. They should also look at some of the other more constitutional UBI models, and they should think about what it means. What would it mean to have a constitutional approach to basic income? So one option would be to combine basic income with some supplementary, like emergency basic income type models, as some people have supposed. But let me leave that aside for now and conclude with some open questions and challenges. So again, the optimal balance we need to find is between rules on the one hand and discretion on the other hand. Concretely, this means how much weight should we place on systems like UBI on the one hand, and how much should we place on discretionary transfers and other interventions on the other hand. Also, we should remember that constitutional basic income is very vulnerable to fiscal crises, monetary crises, also election populism, and many other sources of tension that could mean that even if we manage to get kind of a constitutional UBI system in place that satisfies Buchanan's criteria and so on, it might be very hard to keep in place for long. So we need to warn about those. So, and even if we do find a good constitutional model and we manage to keep it in place, we still need the capacity to reform the system every now and then. And constitutions are hard to reform, so we need to embed those capacities for reform inside the rules of the system itself. So we need quasi-permanent rules, not too rigid and not too flexible, which of course is easier said than done. But I do believe thinking about constitutional UBI is the right way forward, and thinking of moving towards quasi-permanent crisis management framework holds some promise of strengthening the rule of law and perhaps also making basic income more permanent and more sustainable over the long run. I will end there, and thank you very much.
So actually, I'm just thinking about if one day we can put the UBI as a constitutional rule, as you proposed. I'm thinking about if we need to change the constitution and we will need a referendum. And I'm just imagining that this kind of the referendum will be proposed by a left-wing government or the right-wing government.
So one of the problems, of course, is that you know, if the constitution is not, first of all, you can write anything on some constitutional level, and if nobody follows the constitution, it doesn't matter. So you need to have a culture of respecting the constitution, and then you also need some agreement on the rules of how to change the constitution. So that's why you have different amendment processes, you have different constitutional conventions, you have various means of building inbuilt responsiveness. So one way is to simply have a constitutional rule that we have basic income, but if we have a state of emergency that could also be defined constitutionally, then in a state of emergency you can have extra powers granted to people on top of that to change the basic income system. But the idea would be to have some kind of quasi-permanence. But thinking about how this can be made so that it appeals to all the different political parties, because you definitely don't want one political party to implement their ideology on the level of the constitution. The constitution has to be something that it has strong support from the vast majority, the kind of super majority of the people.
Yeah, because before your speech, because it's more common to imagine the UBI just as a policy, but not as a part of the constitution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I invite people to think about what this means and what it could mean and what the challenges are.
So what do you say if we can put the UBI as a constitutional level, it can give the people more freedom or more equality, or?
So of course, it's hard for people to imagine having something like UBI as a constitutional rule as such, but it's not completely crazy. I mean, you have, for example, in Brazil, of course, you have the example of Eduardo Suplicy and the attempt to have a constitutional guarantee of something like basic income. It hasn't always worked out so well, also in the case of Brazil. So this also shows that there are many practical problems in this. And also it needs to be suited for the different countries' requirements. So Germany actually has a very interesting constitutional approach to the welfare state. Like, there are some welfare rights. I'm not an expert on the German constitution, but there are welfare rights implemented inside the constitution. And so, that would be a building place for that. And different countries will need to approach it slightly differently. But even if you don't have an official constitutional rule, you could have something like quasi-constitutional. So you could have sort of like a central bank you have now as a kind of a guarantor of monetary stability. You could have an equivalent for basic income, like a separate entity outside of the parliament which handles basic income. You could even use existing institutions to do this, but you just want it to have some kind of autonomy and some kind of stability over long term.
And the professor, would you like to say something about the Otto speech?
Yeah, I think that the contractarian approach, and especially the idea of the democrat from the viewpoint of research and also from the viewpoint of thinking about it in real life, is still in its infancy. Why? Because many didn't get that idea, for example, from a natural state view, just like Buchanan, in an anarchic society, that you can generate, and that's very important, peace and also compensation if you are a potential loser. Yes. And that's very important, more important than we may imagine. For example, in the European Union, we try to generate rents and assumed, as it is or was just like in globalization, the economies, that everyone will win, at least on the average, and at least in the long term. But we see that this does not happen, that we become more and more inequality, and individuals become more and more resistant against the quasi-constitutional rules which are not really and formally properly regulated. And for these things, a democrat, from the viewpoint of Buchanan, especially from its limits of liberty, is a very important thing. And I think the UBI can contribute to it a lot, much more from this political-economic viewpoint than others with ideas of setting free, say, time sovereignty and so on, might imagine. This is very important as a constitutional basis for modern life, especially under digitalization and so on and so forth, when we move into a lot of unforeseen contingencies where very precise, yes, targeting and means testing will not help at all. It will not help at all, and the social market economy, say at Germany and many other social welfare states, will erode more and more. I'm very sure about that, and for that we need just such a governance mode. That's very important, and Otto's contribution to that is very, very important. Thank you very much, Otto.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Neumärker, and I'm also very happy that you are one of the people who is doing research and developing what Ordnungspolitik means for the future in this realm. So, but I think most of the research still needs to be done, and that's why I'm so happy that this institute exists, and hopefully it can be one of the places to do this research.
Yeah, sure.
So thanks, Otto, for your speech. And now it's my turn. And let me share with my screen. So my topic here is UBI as a form of the social contract and experimental approach. When we are thinking about the basic income experiment, maybe the first question that crosses in our mind can be what or if everything or if anything can justify the basic income experiment. And here, my experiment investigates whether the choice of the basic income can be justified in the original position under the view of ignorance. Or in the other words, we are going to see if the participants would be more motivated to choose the basic income under the view of ignorance. The famous view of ignorance has been proposed by Rawls. He believes that when people do not know their social status or their distribution or their fortune, their intelligence or abilities, people would always unanimously choose the fairness principle, which will improve the welfare of the worst of group member when they need to. People were willing to do so because they are so scared of being the worst of one. However, like many experiments have confirmed, the choice of the Rawlsian justice is somehow reluctant. And actually, this experiment is inspired by a paper from the FRIBIS, which states there are at least 2 reasons to reject the Rawlsian justice. One of the reasons can be the risk-seeking behavior of the participant, and the other reason can be the involvement. In my experiments, we will focus on the participants who are inferred to be the relatively risk-loving and the difference with the involvement. In short, if participants would not choose the Rawlsian justice, as many experiments suggested, under the view of ignorance, can basic income be an option as their social contract? Let's see together. The experiment we are going to see today is composed with 2 stages. Briefly speaking, the main task of the participants is to choose a distributional role for the wealth. And in the first stage, participants have to make the decision when they are involved. And then in the second stage, participants need to choose for others. In this way, we will compare the difference about the involvement. And as we mentioned before, to infer if a participant is relatively risk-loving, they are asked to do a risk tolerance self-assessment before they enter the first stage of the experiment. Then, my dear is, maybe the risk-seeking behavior counts not only as an inherent personality, the external circumstance can also be a reason. For testing the difference of it in the first stage, participants would be divided into scenarios, the risk scenario and the no-risk scenarios, and they will proceed to the second stage together. In summary, you can have a look at the small table on the right hand. The similarity of two stages would be the choice are interpreted by the same principles. The difference are, as we mentioned before, the involvement in the scenarios in the first stage. And I would also like to mention another point is a cost. To realize each principle in the first stage will not be considered, but it can be compared in the second stage. So as the very first part of the experiment, the risk tolerance self-assessment is designed to be a very short one. It's based on the normal questionnaires that the bank usually will require the clients to fill out before they can recommend some investment strategy or portfolios. And we know the higher your risk tolerance is, the more likely to be a relatively risk-loving person. So the participants who get more than 2 points in this short assessment will be marked as relatively risk-loving. So let's begin our first stage when the participants is involved. And as you can see, here participants will need to decide a distributional rule for themselves, and it will apply to his wealth. And for the scenario A and the scenario B, the risky and the non-risky one, we ask the participant to randomly choose a group to get their initial wealth. So you can see regarding the difference between the risky and the non-risky scenario will be, in the non-risky scenario, the initial wealth will be described as a set. It means their initial wealth can only be one of these 3 elements. And then, on the other hand, in the risky scenario, the initial wealth will be described as an interval. So in this interval, the probability to be a relatively richer one is much more higher than the set of the no-risky scenario. So we think this interval can be considered as a much riskier information. So in this way, we can see the difference in 2 scenarios, but however, a participant will never know his exact initial wealth. So in this way, we can also create the original position and the view of ignorance. And after a participant has chosen their group, they will face a question. They will need to decide for distribution of the extra wealth. And they need to choose a distribution role from one of these 3 categories. We have 3 main categories. The Rosen justice will be the first one. The Rosen justice is interpreted by the principle of equity and the consequential equality, because these 2 principles are focused on the improvement of the distribution of the worse-offs. And then we have the basic income. With the principle of the basic income, every participant will receive the same from the extra, or we can see here the second distribution. And then we have the principle of merit or desert. In this way, the distribution will depend on a math quiz. That means if you get a higher score from this math quiz, you will get even more from the extra distribution. Here we can see, according to the simple statistical results, among the participants who do not choose the Rosen principle, the risk-loving group counts for the majority. However, what is more surprisingly is none of the risk-loving participants would like to choose the principle of consequential equality for their distribution in both scenarios. And this more detailed regression table, you can see the result of the risk loving as an explanatory variable is very significant and interesting. In the no-risky scenario, if the Rosen principle has not been chosen, the risk-loving participants would prefer basic income as their distributional rule. And these results can maybe partly justify the choice of the basic income. And for the risk-loving participants in the risky scenario, it's more significant to not choose the Rosen principle. Instead of it, they will go for the principle of the merit, and the tendency to be risk-seeking is increased. So in different scenarios, there is no consistent choice. This also shows that, in fact, the choice under the view of ignorance is relatively fragile. And later, in the second stage, participants are asked to choose the welfare system for others. In each welfare system, we have 5 income levels. In each income level will be taxed with different tax rate and receive the different welfare payment. And I know it seems a lot of information here, but it can be concluded with a table. Let me show you. You can see in the table that the system 1 and 4 will guarantee a flat welfare payment. The idea of a flat welfare payment is very similar to the basic income. So we will count the system 1 and the system 4 as the principle of the basic income. Then the system 2 and 3 are focused on the improvement of the worth of group. So we will count these 2 systems as a Rosen principle. And last, the system 5 will distribute the welfare payment increasingly from the rich to the poor. It means if you are relatively rich here in system 5, you will get even more from the welfare payment. So it's our principle of the merit. From the results you can see here, it was very different from the previously stage. This is about 27% of the risk lovers chose system 2, which has never happened before. If you remember, in the previous stage, in both scenarios, none of the risk-loving participants has chosen the principle of the consequential inequality. But here, we can see when they need to choose for others, there are more than 27% have chosen this principle for others. From here, we can see there might be some difference about the involvement. But still, we need to go for our regression table. So in the regression table, for each category, we have first the choice in the second stage, which has not been highlighted. And where it's highlighted means the choice has been shifted. For example, the more R for others means if a participant have not chosen the Rosen principle in the first stage, but they have chosen the Rosen principle in the second stage for others. However, it's a pity here, no more evidence can be provided for the choice of the basic income, but it occurs a positive and significant effect which states for the relatively risk-loving participants, they are more likely to choose a Rosen principle when they choose for others. So the result is basically consistent with the FRIBIS rejection. And rethinking about the experiments, I think there are still somewhere to be improved. And unfortunately, due to lack of the sample size and the necessary personal information, most explanatory variables are not significant. The overall data and the results under the design are consistent with the FRIBIS rejection, but it can only be partly justify the choice of the basic income under the view of ignorance. I mean, there are some certain personal factors will drive the person or drive the people to choose the basic income under the view of ignorance. And I think if we can figure out these factors, it can help us better promote the implementation of the UBI. And if I'm able to do so, my experiment about the basic income will be justified fully. So I give a quick presentation about my my experiment, and what are you thinking about it?
Should I start with the question?
Yes, yes, please.
Yeah, okay. For me, what was very interesting is that you reported that if you have a society with enough risk-loving, then the Flaubert rejection holds. Yes.
Yes.
This means impartiality, yes, is okay, but not the principle of justice. Yeah, roughly spoken. Do you think that this is related to a society which loves competitive markets? This means competition as a risk to lose or to win, yeah? So that they invest a lot in the potential of the markets, but you know, markets are from time to time highly riskful. If on the average or only in the short run, might be perhaps the other question. And related to that, do you think that more risk-averse or risk-neutral individuals do not indicate the Flaubert rejection because they like more, for example, UBI as an insurance or as a device generating time sovereignty, for example, that you are not so dependent on the market outcome and therefore not the risk of playing the market game? Do you think that you could show this, that you see, then concerning the contract or the social contract or the private market rules, that there might be competition only valuable for risk-loving individuals, so therefore they do not take care too much about the justice, especially of a UBI system? And is that then really the world in which we would like to live, so that too much competition could exist?
So I think if our market is really competitive, we can consider it as my risky scenario. And in the risky scenario, let me show it again. So in the okay, so as we can see in the risky scenario, for the people who is inferred to be relatively risk-loving, and I think they will not go for the basic income. And on the other hand, if the circumstance is not so much risky, if for the people who has not choose the risk or rose injustice, they will go for the basic income. So we can see that if the market is not so competitive, at least for the risk-loving person, they will prefer the basic income. And the point is, for the pattern of a not risk-loving person, it's not very clear in my experiment, but I think If yes, I think if the market is not so competitive, the person will prefer the basic income, because as you can see, also if circumstance will drive person to also become a relatively more risk-loving person. So if our circumstance is not so competitive, maybe the basic income can be a better choice for the people.
So a second question, perhaps, if it's allowed. So market is perhaps highly related, I would say, to the principle of merit and desert. Yeah?
Yes, yes.
So therefore, with merit, loved, so to speak, by risk lovers,
Yes.
then we could see that these economies who believe always in competition, just like one could say that the Germans with the old-fashioned ordoliberalism have to believe in market competition, then they will not choose heavily the principle of basic income, or?
Exactly, I think so.
Okay, and then the second question, do you have control, perhaps, the distribution between risk-averse, risk-neutral, and risk-loving all over the population?
Yes, it's let me show you here. So if we I'm sorry, I have not included in this slide, but I did it in my personal analysis. It's about not more than 13% of the people are inferred to be the relatively risk-loving.
Is that a result of the experiment? By
yes.
Asking them? Okay, so it's, so to speak, endogenous. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this would mean it depends on the participants, on the probants in your experiment, that the Germans are not too much risk-loving, or?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. I think there should be some difference between the developed country like Germany and some developing country, for example, China, or some countries in Africa, and they are, they need to be relatively risk-loving to, to have their basic life. And in this case, they cannot expect to have the basic income in their daily life. So in this case, I think the pattern will be quite different. And in fact, there should be some geographical difference in areas, and there are already the experiment has state for it. It's not so clear, but the pattern did exist.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps I can ask a question, or are we out of time?
Yes, of course.
So do you think that people would choose different principles if production was involved and not just redistribution, as a factor that, redistribution can affect also how much money there is overall, right? It can affect production. And so if that is included, of course you haven't studied it, so you won't be able to say, but in the real world, of course, redistribution is also related to production. So how would you go about, or how would somebody else go about doing like further research on this, do you think?
If we would like to also consider the production, I think it will also need to include this incentive. If we got the basic income, the people will lose the incentive to produce more. And I think there are always some discuss between the efficiency and the implementation of the UBI. So some countries are encouraged to put the UBI only on the unemployment person, or some, but the idea is if we do so, the UBI is not UBI anymore because it's not universal anymore. So if we would like to be a universal, the idea is everyone should receive it, even the production will be affected by some way. Okay, now I think we can put the turn to Professor Neumärker. Professor, will you give your speech?
Okay, I also try to share the screen.
Yes.
So here it is. So my contribution will be based more or less on the same aspects and assumptions as Lida's contribution, but it will be, say, more normative in asking the basic questions behind Lida's design. So let's see, I can be short with several slides because Lida has presented. Here, what will be the difference to Lida's presentation is that I would like to present my idea of new ordoliberalism. Otto said it, that Freiburg and the Freiburg School of Economics is based on ordo economics, on ordoliberalism, and ordoliberalism is highly related, at least from the normative point of view, to social contractarianism. And we will see that UBI might be an essential part of the just and sustainable social contract. And then I would like to show the basics of social contract on UBI in theory and experiment, much more on a basic level than Lida's contribution. And then I would like to combine it and add it to the new ordoliberalism of social contracted euro dividend. This means a certain approach. I will not have enough time to show also foreign aid basic income in our research group FRIBIS, but this will be also presented in another session. So, new ordoliberalism. We start, as Lida did it, and also Otto, especially with the modern contractarians. Buchanan is a modern contractarian. You all may know the famous philosopher John Rawls. Economists know Dennis Müller and others, but also indirectly and with more relevance to UBI. For example, Van Parijs in the 1980s, here especially together with Van der Veen in 1987, applied Rawlsian arguments to their approach of UBI. And it's not directly mentioned with respect to social contracting on UBI, but they apply the Rawlsian logic to some extent. Second, I was highly influenced in 1992 by contribution, a book of Froelich Oppenheimer, where they discussed experimental tests of different contractarian approaches. And by that way, they implemented also in their schemes a so-called floor constraint. For example, Colombino did that also in his famous article from 2015. And this is at least an implicit introduction to UBI. We will see it. Buchanan, the constitutional democrat, Otto has explained it. I don't have to add something to it. In 1995, Tony Atkinson, a more, compared to Buchanan especially, more left-wing thinker, on redistribution. Yeah, he combined in a book contractarian logic and the idea of a basic income. I will show it. I will show his scheme on one of the next slides. And last but not least, myself, in different publications, introduced to new ordoliberalism based on contractarian knowledge, contractarian logic, and on a certain governance mode. Here you see Atkinson's approach. he argued now on the contractarian stage in the concerning constitutional choice. The interesting thing here is the choice of individuals unanimously behind the wheel of uncertainty or Rawlsian wheel between UBI or a simple social insurance graduate tax system, just like the workfare system, the social insurance system we have nowadays in Germany and many modern welfare states. And in the post-constitutional stage, applying the political machinery, he would suggest there we choose for financing UBI or the regular traditional social insurance system, the level of the tax rate, especially for UBI, and the level of tax rates as well as the level of the social insurance benefits when we choose a social insurance system. His argument was that in the constitutional stage, we should also decide on the level of UBI. Therefore, you see on the political machinery, the post-constitutional stage, from his point of view, has to take care only about financing it by choosing a certain tax rate. By the way, he was interested only in taxing income, not another tax base, therefore not choosing a tax base because income was set with him, and he wanted to implement a flat rate income tax. So in the constitutional choice, you see in the end, his idea is UBI versus a traditional system financed by a graduate taxation system. It could be UBI, for example, versus a negative income tax versus the classical social insurance. And in the post-constitutional level, you would set the parameters T prime, the marginal tax rate, and G, the UBI level, for example, all the different parameters of a more complex targeting a social insurance graduate tax system. But what is interesting, you could also, as Buchanan mentioned, decide on the tax rate on a certain budget or tax constraints in the constitutional stage. For example, on the tax tariff, on the tax base, and or on UBI. Yes, if you have decided, for example, on the tax base for UBI, then UBI, yes, tax revenue divided by the number of the residents, of the citizens, will be the level of UBI G. They could be also parameters of the constitutional choice. So therefore, Atkinson's approach is not at all clear, but he examined it in his book. And I found it very interesting that a thinker about a distribution, more left-wing thinker, applied an approach, how to decide on it, on a more conservative thinker, namely Buchanan. So the traditional ordoliberalism applied this, and from my viewpoint of the new view, in a modern social contract approach, we have to add to the collective contract decisions of ex ante fair rules. This is the traditional social contract theory. For example, Otto and Lida contributed to it. I added to this ex ante fair rules ex post very important checks. This means additional items. First, any constitutional rule or any rule on UBI has to survive the ex post justice check. I call this consequence proofness or conflict reform or renegotiation proofness, because the individuals believe from the ex post point of view in the post-constitutional stage that an ex ante fair rule is unfair, then you have no one who would like to fight for the ex ante fair rule from the ex post point of view. So therefore, you need a proof that the individuals will not attack the ex ante fair rule. Fahrenberg and others solved it simply by if you decided on an ex-ante fair rule in the traditional contract, then you have to comply to the rule. But take it serious, this is not very soundful and natural if individuals by a large majority attack the rule from the ex post point of view, then something with the rule might be wrong. On the other hand, one should check if the rule, for example, for UBI, is individual and political strategically non-manipulable, that the individuals do not try to adjust their behavior to receive what they want by eroding the constitution. This means they do not attack the rule, but they behave strategically, for example, showing wrong preferences to receive their result. So in the end, it might be that everyone is lying, for example, in holding the constitution, and the result is not at all in accordance to the real preferences of the citizens from the ex post point of view. That's what Hervé Mollin called strategy proofness. The rules have to be either self-enforcing, then you need a self-enforcing constraint that no one attacks it. The World Trade Organization, for example, was erected by the idea of self-enforcing because the organization, at least from a global point of view, was very flat with no real hegemonic institution, or you delegate, generate and organize hierarchical enforcement power. That's then a governance constraint. For example, in Europe, when we had the a public debt crisis, Germany, from an evolutionary point of view, became more and more the hierarchical enforcement power, the endogenous hegemon. So therefore, the original idea of the self-enforcing constraints in a flat European Union eroded more and more. But the European Union was decided to be a self-enforcing institution, and therefore the governance constraint was not built explicitly by design, and that might be a mistake. So 1 up to 3 define institutional contractarian, what I call social sustainability, which generate in the end the durability, the stability, and the state capacity in enforcing the ex-ante fair and ex-post socially sustainable social contract. And now it would be interesting to prove it. So other parts of new ordoliberalism, like reform economics or the economics of conflict and power, you see they are related to reform and renegotiation proofness. And as Otto said it, it has to be related also to reform flexibility, yes? That the rules have to be flexible whenever we are confronted with unforeseen contingencies in the future. Then it might be that an ex-ante fair rule might not be renegotiation proof. So therefore, we solve the proofness, or we cannot solve it perfectly, then we need some governance for reform flexibility, a so-called second best constitution. And the analysis of conflict and power is related to conflict proofness of the UBI social contract. What I would now examine on the next slides is the experimental social contract research approach. If you know now ex-ante fair contracts, and I will take care more about ex-ante fair contracts, and you know the problems of new ordoliberalism with respect to ex-post social sustainable UBI contracts, we have to interlock and endogenize topics, and this makes models highly complex, but we need that harmonization to move towards enforceable UBI contracts, social contracts for the modern societies. Now, concerning the just social contract, Froelich Oppenheimer mentioned our use of experiments to generate consensus on the questions of distributive justice has led us to conclude that the experimental laboratory provides a method for making cumulative progress in ethics which cannot be solved without experiments. Yeah, and the problem is what you see here. Lida mentioned roles, but there were competitors to roles, for example, with risk neutrality. What could be a distributive justice principle? That was the original question of Rolik Oppenheimer. And there was first, under the mentioned situation of impartiality, under the wheel of uncertainty, where individuals do not know what would be the distribution of outcome towards them, what would be their position in the future, a seemingly highly artificial decision-making procedure concerning the rules. One solution could be Harsanyi. You would like to maximize expected utility or the expected average. One model which we know is behind it in terms of income is maximizing GDP. Yes, a sum, a certain sum. Or on the other hand, Rawls, who argued, yeah, we should maximize the worst of the situation of the worst of individual, maximizing min, and both can be generated from social contractarian logic. But which one is what the society likes? It's just like Lida's idea, should we choose between basic income and merit and desert or something different. But you will see here, basic income arises as an endogenous solution between Harsanyi and Rawls. Yeah, and the interesting fact is, if we have the constitutional settle, would the individuals opt for maximizing expected utility, as Harsanyi argued, or would they optimize towards the worst of individual? Van Veen van Parijs started, for example, with Rawls, and they ended up on UBI. Or will they choose another principle like a UBI principle? Yeah. And on impartiality, Lida gave you an introduction to, and we know impartiality is very important to generate rules which do not depend on your specific position, so that you can argue, because I'm rich, I'm voting for rules which are good for the rich. Then we can say, okay, we will never find a constitutional or a contractarian consensus. So such a decision is not very useful. We need a normative basis, and that is impartiality behind the wheel. So the wheel generates the impartial observer, and then we see the impartial observer is an ideal. Is it an utopian approach? And the experiment shows it is not, because it depends on the imperfect information under the wheel of uncertainty. And what we can identify is arguments in the chat protocol by finding in the experiment some reasons, some arguments for basic income or against basic income, which are resilient in repeated experiments in that scheme. And then we could see or identify these arguments as resilient points, as resilient arguments of the contract, and other arguments can be refuted by the experiment that they are not relevant for constitutional choice. So therefore, you see from the artificial introduction to the experiment, you can draw real life arguments by real life design of a constitution by arguing certain points would always refuted in the experiment. So these are not good arguments for a UBI contract, but we have arguments which survive repeated tests. So these are good arguments in the normative discourse in political life. So therefore it sounds artificial, but in the end we can identify via the chat valuable normative arguments. So, and the question is, how far is UBI then a solution? Is it dependent, as Lida also posed the question, on risk aversion? You see, you mentioned more risk loving, I mentioned more risk aversion. Or do we need infinite risk aversion for the maximum, or more risk neutrality, which is necessary for GDP maximization. Yes? If you would like to have a social dividend as a share of GDP and you accept maximized GDP, this means your UBI is based on utilitarianism. And this is very important to have the knowledge that this is a specific aspect of the social dividend as a part of a GDP. Then you accept utilitarianism. But do the individuals in a society accept in a UBI system the additional rule of utilitarianism? I'm not sure about that. So in the experiment, the individuals choose between different solutions and they test by impartial choice different schemes, yes, in the experiment. So, and the idea is principles that survive with unanimous support have the claim to validity as principles of justice. Those that do not show any strength at all are rejectable. And the principle surviving in repeated experiments is the right one. And as Lida said it, it depends if different principles can survive and only one. So in our experiment, it was very, very interesting that the agreement could in principle, the consensual agreement could in principle depend on degree of risk, inequality aversion, but how does this lead the society towards or against UBI as a contractarian agreement depending on risk aversion and or what is in that the same inequality aversion. So in our predictions, we deal with the trade-off between high income and insurance against the worst case. Here we deal with risk. We deal with the trade-off between highest and lowest income, dealing with inequality. We deal with the trade-off between marginal and highest basic income. Marginal with Harshani, no basic income is really needed. And Rawls, this might be the highest basic income when we assume that we pay for individuals a floor constraint. Okay, results should be robust to yield a general valid theory. This is solved by the repetition concerning the outcome and the payoff scheme, if it is stable, robust, and the resilience of certain arguments in the chat. If we could include these arguments as normative arguments in political arguments on UBI, or if we can exclude them because they never survived the unanimity check. So we informed the probants about the distributive theories, about Harshani and Rawls, and not so much about UBI because we said we have a floor constraint. Simply check it. We have test persons, Froelich Oppenheimer in US, Canada, Poland, and the SoCoLab students in Germany with different group size, at least 5, due to the 5 regimes. The regimes between the individuals could choose their maximin, that's Rawls, max the average, that's Harshani, maximizing the average with the income floor, yeah, and maximizing with income floor and income ceiling, yeah. So you see here, why should there be an interest in UBI? First, the constitutional interest in partial or full basic income for all, should it be there? And second, UBI as a very simple redistributive scheme between maximin and max average. So to give it more structure. Here is the structure, the income distribution, and you see income distribution first is the highest average, that's utilitarianism, and fourth is maximizing the worst of, you see the lowest income was 15,000, and in between we had floor constraints of 13,000 and 14,000, yeah. Under utilitarianism, we had a certain floor constraint also, which was given by the competitive market in itself. The 12,000 were realized only by the market economy. as the lowest income. A highly heroic assumption, but we did that. And therefore, you also see under utilitarianism, the range is the highest, under Rawls, it's the lowest. And concerning the income distribution, reflecting also different disincentive effects, therefore the production side, Otto mentioned this, that this is important. We didn't reflect this a little bit. You see, regime 2 showed higher disincentives, versus regime 3 allowed a little bit less disincentives, but therefore a higher average, but also a higher floor constraint, because the individuals could be more productive, but with also a higher range. This would mean they would choose for more risk aversion. So in that experiment, it was highly interested, and this are my concluding slides now, that there is a general support in all these experiments towards basic income scheme as the basic principle of fair income distribution. And my argument was that, especially for future times, this would be a new version out of new ordoliberalism towards a social market economy. Second, we detected in the chat an important sequential logic. Individuals like basic income first. This means the floor constraint. They choose the floor constraint due to justice and insurance for any individual to some basic level. Not the highest one, not Rawls, but to some basic level. The final social choice then depended only on more or less range. Therefore, some societies of progress were more inequality averse, others less. And if that was solved, then the argument was market transaction and market distribution is acceptable. Whereas markets lead to efficiency and basic income leads to justice and solving problems of inequality. This clearly means, compared to the traditional social market economy, that social market economy means now justice first by basic income first instead of efficiency first. And the next steps in these equilibria will be if they also will hold in the long run due to this free ex post governance constraint. We didn't control them. We controlled them only for the so-called euro dividend. And the euro dividend on the European level, as on top of national levels, UBI, is much more in line with the ex post governance constraints than any other social distributive regime in Europe. Thank you very much, and I wait for the questions.
So first, we need to answer a question from the audience. And I put it also in our chat, as you can see. The Hans Florian Royer has asked, in a society based on the division of labor, both activities with the price tag in economic and without are essential for the social cohesion. From its perspective, is a UBI not an initial welfare for system, also distributed to an individual?
It depends on how you measure then welfare for society. That was exactly the problem in my in my presentation, that you may argue the welfare of society is measured in a utilitarian mode, yeah? In terms of income by maximizing GDP, then you could expect a maximization of the average income, yeah? But then the basic income would be quite smaller than under different distributive schemes. In the different distributive schemes, inequality aversion, yeah, plays an important role. And if inequality aversion is added to welfare for society, because the individuals do not like the pure risks of competition and markets, yes, then they would like to be insured against it. then this would mean the outcome would be an UBI as an essential welfare for society in terms of the ex-ante chosen regime, which should be also from the ex-post point of view, self-enforcing, a renegotiation proof and also strategy proof. And if, for example, a UBI regime is not strategy proof because the individuals would not like to show their truthful behavior by mimicking that they are others, then we might have a serious problem with the essential welfare for society. So therefore, this has to be solved, that also from the ex-post point of view, this essential welfare choice of the society is kept without any erosion by strategy proofness or by strategic manipulation or by renegotiation.
Thank you, Professor. And it seems also Otto has a question.
Yes, thank you very much. That was indeed very interesting. And I have two questions. You can answer one or two of them depending on how much time we have. So the first one is regarding the choice of the different moral principles and in the social contract. So you mentioned the income inequality principle and the possibility of a ceiling as a weighting on the contract or the choice of the principles. So, but from a purely utilitarian expected average utility point of view, I think it's easier to understand how people can reach an income floor than how they can reach an income ceiling. Do you think that from a pure utilitarian point of view, the income ceiling can be justified without taking into some other considerations?
Yeah, it was very interesting with the concerning perhaps I may move back to that for a moment. Move back to the argument by sharing the screen once again. Here you see it was very interesting that in the outcome of these experiments, the only question was, do the individuals choose income distribution 2 or 3? Yes. In the income distribution 2, the floor constraint was low, relatively low compared to 3. Yes. But the range was also lower. Yeah. And it was different. That was the interesting thing, because we decided these are two societies. And this here is clearly concerning the average, less productive. You mentioned this, yes, maximizing the average means higher production, but they are more inequality averse, so therefore they would vote for the lower range, yeah. And the argument is both vote for a basic income, yeah, but the society which is a little bit more inequality averse, they accept a lower basic income, a lower floor constraint, yes? And it was only in the end, in all these experiments, we had also experiments with more than 4 schemes, yes, to hide UBI even a little bit more. It was interesting that only the choice was different only with respect to the range. It was clear that they would like to have a certain basic income, not the lowest one from the market economy with a GDP maximization, and not the Rawlsian, yeah. But societies were not very clear with respect to the range they would like to choose. So I would say concerning your order, it's clear that they like a certain basic income, not the highest one which is possible, but one which gives them seemingly enough insurance against the hard post-constitutional life of the market economy. Therefore, you see, still we are still in a liberal mood of the society, yes. Whereas the others said, oh, for us, inequality does not play such a big role. So therefore, we allow a higher range and expect therefore a higher basic income, which is paid out of more productivity. Yeah, and that's very interesting. It's not clear if the individuals always believe in productivity of the post-constitutional state. This means when they like risk, if they like risk, but they always like the basic income. So does this solve your question? Because this means range is less important than the basic income.
Yes, I wonder, yeah, I guess that just means that they did not go for a pure expected average utility maximization.
Yeah, exactly. That is it. They do not like maximizing any sum, yes? And that's always an assumption behind our social market economies. Therefore, you see why I called it a paradigm shift, because in our societies, we always tell you the story that we have to maximize GDP, yeah, for paying enough, as much as we can for the social insurance system, yes, a targeted insurance system. Individuals do not seem to believe too much in it. They say, please have the basic income first, and then if we are insured, yeah, by the residual, we believe in the market economy, yeah, generating the basic income. We do not believe in maximizing GDP. So therefore, the utilitarian mode of governance is completely ruled out. Yeah, that's very important to mention from my point of view.
My final comment on this is that, of course, you could say that maximizing GDP does not actually maximize average utility. So you still have a utilitarian model that doesn't rely on GDP as a metric. But anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, I see your point. But you know, my argument is in Germany, all is related to the sum. Yes, all these other constraints are defined in such a way that they have to be in line with the sum. Yeah, so therefore these are definitively not real constraints, because when the sum is not maximized, then social insurance system is not good. Yeah? In that way is how we discuss it, and we should discuss it first that these are real constraints, so that GDP maximized under constraints is not the maximized GDP. Yeah. And second, if we invert, and that's the paradigm shift, if we invert it, that justice based on UBI, yes, is in the objective function, then GDP for organizing and paying out UBI is a restriction and is not necessarily in the objective function. That's a real paradigm shift. Yeah. That's very important to notice, because we are still living, we all in the Western world still believe in these win-win situations, which give us always the best, yeah, if we agree from the ex post point of view. Yeah, but these win-win situations, in these win-win situations, many individuals behave strategically in a manipulative way. So therefore, these are no real win-win situations, yeah, because some maybe end up as losers.
Thanks.
Okay.
And so the time is over, and our panel session will stop here. Thanks everyone for watching. If you are interested in our conference or studies or institutions, please visit our website. And thanks very much. See you.
Thank you and bye-bye.